China communist or capitalist? Right, asking this question, what was China before the revolution? I do have to touch on this because, a bit of history is always useful. China in ancient times was a very important country, culturally, politically and economically. Many of the technologies that we take for granted in the modern world originated in China. You can think of things like paper, printing, clocks, porcelain, the mariner's compass, which was used to travel around the world, silk manufacture. All these were technologies that originated in China and which had eventually worked their way through to the European countries, which ultimately became the first in the Industrial Revolution. In relative terms, you could say China reached its peak probably, say, between the Song dynasty and the early Ming dynasty, say, in Western terms, between the 11th and 15th century. And then in relative terms, it went backwards after that, really. And one of the reasons for this, it was to do with the class struggle in China. There was a conflict between the aristocratic layers and the emperor, and also the bureaucracy supporting the emperor. And on the one hand, you had mercantile classes, the nascent Chinese capitalist class, if you like. They were prevented from developing by trade barriers that were put in place in the 15th century. And these trade barriers ultimately led to China becoming culturally and technologically eventually isolated from the rest of the world. So this is why the Industrial Revolution did not begin in China. And the Chinese government were quite surprised really with what happened, how they first encountered the Westerners, especially Britain. Originally they just encountered Portuguese traders who were just bringing them gold and silver in exchange for Chinese manufacturers. But later it took on a different form because the British began to sell opium in China, and it was just simply a way to make a profit. They wanted China's goods like tea and porcelain, but they didn't want to pay for it with gold and silver. So the way was to try and get the population addicted. And Britain wasn't growing stuff they were growing in their own country. They were growing it in Bengal, which had recently become a British colony in 1759. And so eventually 30 million Chinese people became addicted to opium. And this led to itself to, like drug addiction does, it led to paralysis and internal conflicts and so on. And eventually it came to war because the government eventually had to take a stand. So this was in 1840. They said, we're not taking any more opium. And the British opium traders said, we don't care what you think, we're going to sell this stuff. So it led to war. And Britain, which today claims to be involved in a war against drugs, actually fought a war for drugs. They fought a bloody war, sending gunboats to China in order to sell it opium. And they not only won their so-called right to sell opium to the Chinese people, they also won, for example, the concessions. The concessions meant that whole areas of the Chinese coast and Chinese cities were completely to be run by foreigners, like Hong Kong, obviously, parts of Shanghai, Tianjin, etc., were completely taken over by foreigners. The only Chinese people allowed there were servants. And it led to the further paralysis of Chinese society. And there were a series of revolts. And what did the British and later the French and other rulers do when these revolts happened? They didn't support any kind of democracy in China. They did the opposite. They supported the emperor in trying to put down the revolt. The Taiping Revolt, which involved millions of peasants, I think it was 1867, and this was brutally put down by the emperor with the weapons supplied to them by the Western countries. And eventually all these countries, America and Japan, got involved. And they were all involved in opium trading because they realised that was the way into China. And so China had gone from, even in 1750, as regards production, it was equal with anywhere in the world still. By 1949, which is the time of the revolution, it had become even a third-rate power. And its people, as you could see in the film that I was just the people were really hungry and it was really desperate. So anyway, there was an attempt at resistance, and during the 1930s, Japan invaded China and massacred and oppressed a lot of people. But there was a resistance that formed, and it was the Red Army. The Red Army was formed out of remnants of the Chinese Communist Party that had survived the Shanghai massacre organised by Chiang Kai-shek in 1926. And they regrouped and managed to recruit peasants into forming an army to defend their homeland against both the Japanese invaders and also in opposition to the rapacious landlords. And eventually these guerrilla fighters won through. The USA and its allies were hoping at the end of the Second World War that they could turn Chiang Kai-shek's regime into an ally of the USA, but it wasn't to be. The Red Army marched into Beijing and other cities, and the right-wing forces, the right-wing pro-imperialist forces collapsed. And watching this footage of a film that Louis showed me, I was impressed by the enthusiasm of that period. I also noticed the large number of women taking part in political campaigns. And this was all something that was quite new at the time. For example, women under the rule of the emperors had been quite oppressed. You'd had things like foot binding, for example. And this was to change with the revolution. And I remember seeing a film which involved the building of a school in a village which had never had one before. There had been some literate people in China, but literacy was the responsibility of private tutors and a small layer that worked for the bureaucracy, and it wasn't for the people. Well, this was now to change. There was a huge growth of literacy in the 25-year period after the revolution. And there's the same, I mean, statistics on life expectancy showed that I think it almost doubled actually from about 35 in 1949, or even less, to nearly about 69 by the late 70s. So there must have been a major improvement. Some of that will have been to do with things like barefoot doctors, but above all, the people were better nourished. There had been that improvement. Now, I'm not denying during the revolution there weren't some mistakes made. The Great Leap Forward, for example, there were a lot of mistakes made. It's inevitable. You're trying to build a new socialist society, and some decisions will be taken that are wrong. And some of the measures taken during the Great Leap Forward had to be abandoned because it was causing hunger. And the Chinese government had to build from really very, very little, except the support of the people, really. What little gold reserves there had been in pre-revolutionary China were taken away by Chiang Kai-shek. He took them off to Taiwan. And it showed on that film a visit by Mao to the Soviet Union immediately after the revolution. The Soviet Union pledged a bit of aid to China, but it wasn't as good as they could have done. And eventually that dried up altogether by the 1970s, 1960s because of political disputes between China and the Soviet Union. But anyway, there was a new enthusiasm, and all these achievements were made. 5-year plans were put in place. And there was enormous growth of production as well. Even people think that only happened under capitalism. It began under socialism, actually. And what sort of situation was China in? Actually, China's industrial base has been absolutely hammered. I think there's some statistics on this. And steel production in China, we just heard that the Chinese now produce in 6 weeks as much steel output as the USA in a year. Well, it was the exact reverse before the revolution. In 1920, the USA, it says, produced 350 kilos per head of steel, per head of population, whereas in China it was just 2.5 per head. So it was massively outperformed by these big capitalist countries at that time. So the fact that China's been able to reverse that is a major achievement. And we would say it actually began under socialism. And it was only a state-owned industry that could have had that increase in capacity. For comparison, and this is one correct thing, I disagree with some of the things in this book, why China followed a socialist road. This was brought out in 1989, I think. And the author, I think, didn't quite explain the extent to which China was already moving towards capitalism even in 1989. But he is correct on some points, especially talking about industry. and that a socialist economy, he compares with Britain in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. As Marxists, we refer to something called primitive accumulation, which is how, if you like, how a capitalist country takes off. And a capitalist country, because it doesn't care about the welfare of the people, will just simply harness labour and capital and resources in the most despicable way. So early capitalism involved things like slavery, it involved child labour. In Britain there was an enormous amount of child labour. I mean, kids of 7 were working in textile mills and losing their arms and legs all the time because they were getting caught in the machinery. And the book points out correctly that this sort of thing didn't happen in China. There was a higher level of welfare as compared to the British or most of the European industrial revolutions. So despite continual, there was still poverty. I mean, China was still classed as one of the poorer countries in the world, but there were benefits in a number of ways. I've mentioned, in relation to healthcare and education, and just simply security. Much of the world, say in the 60s and 70s, was dependent on the price of the commodities that they exported. You think of Africa being dependent on the export of cash crops, for example, cash crops, cocoa, coffee, copper, minerals like copper. And if the price of these commodities would fall in the world market, the people would be suddenly impoverished. And then the International Monetary Fund would go into their country and tell the people what to do and flog off what remained of nationalised industry. This sort of thing didn't happen in China because China was socialist at the time. Anyway, want to come on to this. The monthly review has done articles setting out the achievements of the first 30 years of socialist rule. But sorry about Anyway, we have to come forward because we've got limited time to 1978 and Deng Xiaoping. This is 2 years after Mao's death in 1976. Deng Xiaoping was the leader of a right-wing tendency. He called himself a reforming tendency that would find a new socialist road for China. But as it turned out, it was really a road to capitalism. He had been called a capitalist roader by Mao earlier on, when he'd been removed from high positions in the government. When Deng Xiaoping took over in 1978 as the most prominent political leader, this is how it turned out. And he was able to become a prominent politician because of the political dispute with the Gang of Four. These were people associated with the Cultural Revolution. And there'd been a certain reaction against that, but the right-wing forces took advantage of that to push their own pro-capitalist agenda. And one of the first things was to completely change agriculture in China. Now, agriculture had not been a failure. China, there were some statistics on it, it had less agricultural land than India. I think about 15% less agricultural land, and produced between 30 and 40% more food per head of population. And it was also, at that time, distributed more fairly. And that's why you had the jump in life expectancy. Conditions of the people had improved. But anyway, what they said, without even consulting the peasants, we're going to do things differently. Instead of having any kind of collective farming, we're just going to have individual peasant units, and you'll just have to fend for yourself in the wider world. And some peasants at first thought this was a good thing because food prices rose, and so immediately some of them had higher material living standards. But the problem was they lost a lot of the security with that as well. All the peasants, like workers, had belonged to something called a work unit, and that guaranteed you certain welfare and health benefits, and you didn't have to pay for school and everything. But this all changed. So in effect, they started to privatise not only work, but also education and all other things as well. So there was a contradictory period in the 1980s, because it was still possible for some to claim we're moving forwards towards socialism, just we have to involve the market. But really things took up momentum of their own. If you create a capitalist class, they're going to make their own demands, and they're going to work behind the scenes to drive things even further in that direction. And that's how things turned out. Now, when it comes, one of the first things they did in the cities was to create two categories of worker. You had the workers with permanent rights, the ones who've been in the state-owned enterprises, but to these were now added workers in the so-called collectives. And these weren't cooperatives in the real sense at all. These were actually the forerunners to private capitalism. And these workers were on temporary contracts. And so you had setting divisions within the working class themselves according to whether you were in a safe job or a precarious job. And in the 1990s, after the social unrest that involved Tiananmen Square and all, in the 1990s there was a real drive towards privatisation, and many of the state-owned enterprises were sold off. And the ones that remained were increasingly run on sort of capitalist lines. I must say, I've seen footage of mainly female workers in a chicken processing factory, and you might as well have been watching workers, say, in Brazil in a similar place. I mean, you could tell they didn't look at all contented and obviously fed up and everything. This is the kind of tedium that socialism hopes to eventually do away with rather than encouraging. So increasingly China has become instead of the brigades and so on where people collectively decided how to work and so on, instead it's become a very top-down society, and it's just like in Western capitalist countries with a managerial structure and the workers at the bottom just doing what they're told basically. So we would say this is nothing in common with socialism. I want to say something about the kind of world that we're moving into and China's relation to that as well. China is now seen both as an opportunity by the world's capitalists, but also as a potential threat, because they don't like anyone gate-crashing their system. Now there's something you might have heard of, the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership. This is an economic deal being done by the USA to try and instigate opposition to China from other Asian countries. So it specifically excludes China. It's based on countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam even, former socialist countries, the Philippines, trying to get these countries to politically and economically oppose China in order to stop the growth of China. And the USA is diverting enormous military resources as well into trying to do this. There's something called the pivot to Asia. Well, really, it should be called an arms race against China. And we have to take, as communists, we have to take this threat very seriously, because, of course, the arms race was one of the reasons why the old Soviet Union collapsed. Eventually, in order to try and destroy the Soviet Union, the USA spent enormous sums on nuclear weapons, on conventional weapons, chemical weapons, and eventually they forced the Soviet Union to do likewise on the threat of invasion or completely losing the Soviets' influence in the rest of the world. And eventually this became absolutely crushing, not only the economic weight of the arms race on the Soviet people, but also it disfigured Soviet society because they ended up missing out on consumer goods, and Soviet society lost popular cohesion and so on. And their intention is to do the same with China, to force China to spend loads more on the military. And obviously as communists living in an imperialist country, that is a capitalist country with, you know, kind of dominant economic power which has historically invaded other countries, we've got to be aware of that and oppose it. Now, there's not a unanimity among the British ruling class. They're not unanimous. You had George Osborne recently visiting China, and he is going there partly to enrich the City of London traders who want to do currency speculation and renminbi, the Chinese currency. But also he's asking for Chinese capitalists to invest in Britain, or Chinese government enterprises to invest in Britain to boost its nuclear power industry and everything like this. So it shows also the desperation of British capitalism. But just for note, I mean, in the 1950s there weren't any Tory politicians visiting China. One noted politician that visited, British politician that visited China was Harry Pollitt. He was a leader of the British Communist Party. So there's been quite a shift in the kind of alliances that China has as well. Comment on yeah, China is often blamed by US warmongers, and yet, some economists are lauding China as a model, because China seems to show that a developing country can lift itself out of poverty, and they're always trying to claim that that is possible for Africa and the poorer parts of Asia. We actually disagree with that view. Firstly, because China was never a typical developing country. It was a country that was building socialism, and the fact that it was able to use its state in order to promote development was because it was originally a socialist country. And it was able to coordinate production in that way because of it. But anyway, what we are concerned about also as communists, China should, although we can say it was trying to build socialism earlier, we don't say this as communists or even socialists today because it's not egalitarian any longer. China was, in the 1970s, one of the most egalitarian societies in the world, but it's gone from that to being the opposite. It's actually become one of the most unequal countries in the world from the point of view of income distribution and ownership. And so it's now on a par with countries like South Africa and Brazil as regards having a wealthy elite and some very poor people at the bottom. And that this is true within cities and also the enormous gap between city and countryside. And you can see this from what I've heard about rural people migrating to the cities in search of work. And very often they can't even get proper residence rights. So they're treated as second-class citizens, basically. Originally there were laws under socialism to try and stop a chaotic move to the cities as you've got in some third world countries. But under the restoration of capitalism, these laws restricting the rights of rural people have just become another form of oppression, really. And the rural areas, like I say, in the early years of the turn to capitalism, some of them benefited from the rising prices, but that's now gone into reverse now, and the rural areas are easily the poorest parts of China, and you've got some of the western regions that are the poorest, really. And along with this, sadly, is also the return of ethnic tensions. We've seen that in Xinjiang province and in Tibet as well. The situation there is that originally, in Tibet, for example, there was, contrary to what is said in the Western press, there was Tibetan support for the revolution. The troops, the Red Army went in there in 1950, shortly after the Chinese Revolution, and they didn't force things on the Tibetans, but instead the Tibetan peasants, many of them serfs, demanded changes, and they eventually started seizing the land themselves. And so this was regularized, legalized after the event by the government, the seizures of land by the Tibetan peasants. And the ones that went into exile, they weren't ordinary Tibetans, they were the aristocratic ruling layers and a section of the Buddhist hierarchy. They went into exile in India and established a so-called Tibetan government in exile, which is entirely funded by the CIA. I'm not just saying that. You can look at the CIA's own budget records, so to say. They funded the Dalai Lama. And of course what the Dalai Lamas were opposing more than anything was the redistribution of land. In Xinjiang province, I mean, this was an area where you had mainly illiterate nomadic people before, and there were moves towards a development which would take into account the rights of the Xinjiang people. I think the language was being taught in schools and everything. But there were problems. I mean, you would get that in any multi-ethnic society. There were a level of problems. But with the return to capitalism, there's been a wider gulf in Xinjiang province between the ethnic Chinese or Han population and and the ethnic Turkish people, or of the region. This has aggravated things, and likewise, the imperialists are trying to stir this up. They've also got governments in exile as well that would try to separate this region off from the rest of China. What we're saying is that when we grant the rights of national minorities and when we move towards social equality, then we don't need to have these kind of conflicts. And this is something that's come up more recently. You know. But just on the subject of China and the rest of the world, it's sometimes said, and I think some Chinese leaders are trying to move towards the idea, well, we can just try and peacefully fit into the wider world. Yes, our socialism isn't really that dangerous. And by the way, we don't go to war. We don't want to go to war with anyone. We want a peaceful world and so on. But as communists, we disagree with that. There was a thinker called Karl Kautsky who, during the First World War in 1915, put forward the idea of super-imperialism. By this he meant that the peaceful capitalists of the world could peacefully just exploit the workers, and they wouldn't have a world war and they wouldn't get into conflicts. But it's a denial of the facts of the history of capitalism, as he should have known. Because, like I said, capitalism began with slavery and violence of all kinds. It began with colonial sieges and genocide of native peoples and child labour. And really, the capitalists of the world will not move towards any kind of peaceful exploitation. I mean, we can see that the war on terror, for example. China hasn't taken part in any of these military interventions. You don't see Chinese troops going into Afghanistan or Iraq or bombing Syria or anything like that. And that's because China doesn't have a history of oppressing other countries, and it doesn't see its interest as being tied up with that sort of thing. But these small wars that capitalism is engaged in are part of a potentially bigger war, and we need to be really aware of that. Yeah. I want to also touch on environmental issues, because a lot has been said about this. There is an environmental conference coming up in Paris at the moment, and they're claiming to be making an agreement on that. Some of the Western countries are now blaming China, because China is now the single biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. Well, first of all, historically it isn't. This is only very recent, because USA and other countries like Britain have been, burning coal and all sorts of things for years. But also, per head of population, China has actually made some attempt to deal with greenhouse gas emissions. It's spent more than any other country on things like research into alternative energy. So they've got solar farms and wind powers. So it's actually wrong, but anyway, it is true that there isn't a big enough world for everyone to waste resources in the way rich countries do. And China is an example of it. And I mean, all these countries will have to someday harmonise their environmental policies. We would say there's no way that they can actually do this under capitalism, because capitalism is itself a system based on destruction. I think I'll actually bring that to an end. What we want to see is, it's up to the Chinese people, we say this, no one else, it's up to the Chinese people to determine their own future. And this talk is not intended as a lecture saying the Chinese should do this and that. First thing for young Chinese people today is to inform themselves about what's going on, about their own country and about the wider world and about capitalism and socialism, and come up with their own ideas on it. What we do say, though, is that the world we're moving into is becoming more and more dangerous, and we have to know what we're dealing with. The capitalism is a system that does lead eventually to world war and barbarism. We were saying that during the First World War. It happened repeatedly during the First World War. I mean, just think of it. They say it's kept the peace in Europe. You hear people saying that nuclear weapons and the European Union sort of has kept the peace in Europe. There's been barbarous wars all over the world. They're plundering the world all the time. There's millions have died, not only in the Middle East from the bloody military interventions, but also from so-called minor civil wars that stirred up in Africa. There's a region called Congo where you've got millions of people dead just over the last few years as a result of wars over coltan, which is a substance they put in mobile phones. So we need to be aware of that. And China, the Chinese people need to think about their role in the wider world. Do they want to be something progressive that is part of trying to build a better world, which we would say means referring to reverting to a socialist course, or do they want to carry on the road that's going on now, which just will lead towards the same kind of barbarism that we've got in the main capitalist countries?
Yeah, thanks very much, Martin.
Thanks.
It's a very good in-depth look at China. I'm going to open up the floor now for discussion, for debate. If anyone's got any questions or comments, I'm sure